Thank you, Emily, and welcome to everybody who's here. First, I want to apologize for not having a picture of myself like normal, because I do think that's an important element of being able to communicate and have that face-to-face. But this was a last-minute shift to me, and I am on vacation. So I have just been hiking, and it's not really a pretty picture to see me right now. So hence, we are going with the PowerPoint and no video of me today. But I appreciate all of you being here, and hope that you will find some great information in this. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So what we're attempting to do today, based on what was sent out and the presentation format, is identify areas where the governance of your organization may need to be reassessed. One of the things that's happened with COVID is obviously there's been a lot of change, and it's brought some things to light. So we're going to talk about some of that. Then we're also going to talk about bylaws, what's kind of standard in the bylaws, and identify ways that you're taking maybe undue risk for non-compliance, and easy ways that we can make the bylaws more adaptable and flexible, especially for circumstances like we've been in, obviously, these last few months. And then we're going to talk about the state statutes, and again, how and why you should know what's in those statutes. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. So I want to get a feel from all of you, and we're going to do the first poll question here right away. How many of you actually had board members involved? Some of you maybe didn't think of even reaching out to board members. Maybe some boards reached out automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and have Emily post our first one here. And was the board involved in responding to the changes brought on by COVID? Couple people haven't yet responded. Remember, if you want the CPE, you need to respond to each of the polls. And if you have any problems with the polls and you want CPE, please type in a message, and we'll make sure that that gets noted with your response. So it looks like the vast majority obviously did have the board involved, and that's awesome, because that's really what should be happening. The board is the overall governance, and they should be helping guide the ship during this crisis. Ideally, they would have had things and plans already set up in advance of this kind of thing happening. But the reason we're doing this now is to take the opportunity to learn from what we've gone through. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to highlight is, for the most of you, I anticipate priorities shifted when this hit, because you couldn't do status quo, and things were definitely different. So when those priorities shifted, what came to the surface and what became the most vital pieces of accomplishing your mission or communicating internally? Those are things that you really want to highlight and think about as ways that can guide that future focus for strategic reasons, as well as for planning and guiding the future decision making. The other big thing, obviously, that came out of this was the risk of the financial storm. Obviously, there were some things that helped, like the PPP program, and there were a few other federal programs. There were some state programs. There's more potentially on the horizon for some of that. But one of the things, again, that this highlighted was something that we talk about on a fairly regular basis, that you should have some plans for a crisis or a, unexpected circumstance to arise such as this. And so did you have some reserves? How did you approach that? Did you have a line of credit you could draw on if absolutely necessary? So this should again highlight how well you're prepared financially and maybe what you can do. Another consideration is obviously first and foremost, the reason you exist is that mission. And what was the impact when we could not have face-to-face and the shelter in place took effect? Was your mission impacted, or could you carry on? So here's another opportunity again to think about, okay, if we could continue on, that's awesome. It means that potentially we were planned well in advance. We had already put in some adaptable possibilities and technologies to handle it. If not, there could be a couple of things. It could be partially planning issues, but it also could be that I have a mission that requires face-to-face. So I worked with a number of organizations that had to adapt because it was still mission critical to be face-to-face with the clientele. So they had to adapt a little bit differently than those that could do something remote. And then what governance should care about, especially during this time, is to ensure compliance. Because governance doesn't always like to hear this, but they are the fiduciary responsible party for the nonprofit. So they need to make sure that the ducks are in a row and that everything is up to snuff as you go into these types of situations. So that's kind of the high level of what I've been thinking about in terms of what kind of things we might consider as a result of COVID and how we might address things going forward. Now, one of the big questions when we talk about something like this is, what's the liability of governance? And it's been interesting because this is something I had been doing some reading and research on pre-COVID, and with the COVID situation, I've delved even deeper into it. Some people are fully aware of their governance responsibility. Some are not. And it depends on the nature of their organization and kind of what some of their goals are and how they structure their board or how they see a board. And I've been honestly a little surprised to learn in some cases, the board has no idea of their liability or their responsibilities. So this is to take this pause right away and say, okay, what am I responsible for as a member of governance? Well, nonprofits are generally set up as a non-stock corporation without ownership, because obviously a not-for-profit cannot have owners, but they still get the corporate status of limited liability. Now, limited liability does not mean no liability. It's just what it says. It's limited. And what does limited mean? It means that you can't be at risk personally for things that happen in the business or debts incurred if you're doing your responsibilities. And that's where the second two bullet points here are absolutely critical. You have to be doing the essential duties and exercising reasonable care. So with essential duties, you might often have heard of the 3 Ds. You have the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. Now, there's a lot of legal things out there. There's a lot of presentations on this. We even have a presentation if you're interested on more of what those 3 duties require. But for our purposes today, think about it as board members are legally bound to exercise reasonable care when making decisions for the organization. So let's say, for instance, the entity during this time wanted to go for a PPP loan. What's the board's responsibility? Well, to ask the right questions, make sure that you've considered, are you really eligible under the standards? Have you met the applicable things that are stated in the criteria for the loan? Are you going to be able to apply for forgiveness? Will you meet that criteria? taking some reasonable care to ask those questions and make sure that you're not putting your organization at risk. What would be an obvious lack of care is if you have an organization, and again, remember this is purely hypothetical because I don't know of a situation where this is reality, but let's say the nonprofit had $1 million reserve and you still applied for a several $1 million PPP. That could be questioned because now were you really in need of that loan? And should you have taken reasonable care to not do that and assess the situation differently? Can you prove that you had the conversations and deemed that it was necessary based on here these facts and circumstances? If not, you probably have not demonstrated your reasonable care. So that's the point here. And the best way to avoid liability is to be well informed. So if you're well informed, then your chances of having any risk are minimal. One of the things that you have to be well informed about is the bylaws, and we're going to dig more into those in a minute. But let me give you a couple more extreme examples of where a governing body like the IRS or a state charitable oversight commission or some other organization has come in and gone after board members. If your bylaws say that you're supposed to have 6 meetings a year and you have 4 on a regular basis, that could put you at risk if there's a problem down the road. Now, it's not like they're looking for, those and checking off, numbers of board meetings, etc. But if the organization gets in trouble and they go back and they find that there weren't board meetings as required, that leads the door to potential then liability to the actual members of governance, or things that are not documented in the minutes. If decisions are being made but not documented, again, that could be an issue. So governance does need to be aware of their position here and not see themselves as purely strategic leadership or fundraising. Those are all great and important roles of the board, but we can't let those things take precedence over not making sure that governance is taken care of. And a well-run board will have this governance piece taken care of and then can focus pretty easily on those others because they're just well structured and well documented. So that's the point that we're trying to get to here. All right. And please don't hesitate to chime in if you have questions along the way. So what do you need to know? What are those important pieces that you have to think about? Well, one is the bylaws. And hopefully you as a board member, for the board members on, or as staff members, you have given to each board member a copy of those bylaws. The bylaws are basically the rule book, if you will. And you need to understand what's in those. And with that, we're going to put up our second poll question to see how many of you have actually had board members read the organization's bylaws. And remember, it's required to respond if you are looking for CPE. And if you have any issues with CPE or inputting the poll, please type something in the chat for Emily. Okay, 3/4 of you have board members reading bylaws. That's awesome. One of the things that is a best practice, just to make sure, again, base level before you can jump to the higher level functions of a board, is to have them have a good onboarding process that includes a copy of the bylaws and have each board member read the bylaws. One of the things that we've been emphasizing more and more, because with just the COVID storm as well as changes in the marketplace and economy, maybe what you want to do is at least once a year have somebody either on the board or an outside expert or somebody else come in and explain and reiterate those governance responsibilities and make sure that all of those are checked off, so that then you can focus on the things that are probably a little bit more interesting and honestly I think are really critical for the board to work on. There's a question in the chat about bylaws. Don't really know if they read them or not. Perhaps a better question is if they receive them. Excellent point, because if you're a staff member, you don't know. If you're on the board, I would hope that you would be asking that question directly. One of the other suggestions I've heard recently is when you do the annual conflict of interest check, that you do a couple of other things. And one is, I have read the bylaws, or there have been no changes to the bylaws, or I'm fully aware of what's in the bylaws. Some kind of statement about the responsibility around those bylaws. Now, the second thing you need to know is the IRS regulations. And not every board member is going to be well versed in the IRS regulations, and that's okay, as long as you have a good treasurer or executive committee or finance committee, somebody who is taking the deeper dive here and knowing that, or you're working with a CPA firm, or you're working with an outside advisor. So somebody is helping you stay current on those regulations. For many of you, you're good at doing it internally and you've got some processes in place for doing that, but it's important to stay up to date on that. And then the nonprofits are actually set up by state, while the IRS is the one who gives the nonprofit status. It is the state laws that dictate how you have to register, what you have to do to solicit contributions, what you have to do to remain in good standing. So it's critical that you read those state statutes. And it's amazing to me how many things are in there that people don't even know. So for instance, do you know in your state statutes how many board members are required by law? That's one that you should know, obviously. We'll talk about some others here as we go along. So in the bylaws, as I said, it is kind of the rule book for the board. And you can adapt or refine your state statutes, because some of them will have things about meeting conduct and so forth, but it can be overridden by bylaws that are specific to your organization. So keep that in mind as well. You can then customize it to your needs. One of the first things that is generally in bylaws is how often do you have to meet? And what are the requirements for notice of the meeting? And does it have to be in person? First thing I want to recommend with the bylaws, now let me take one step backwards here for a second. I'm going to make a number of recommendations, and I'm not encouraging everyone to go and make these blanket changes right off the bat. I want you to consider them. I want you to discuss them with the board. And if there are some things that should be amended in your bylaws, start working on that list and make it comprehensive, because amending the bylaws isn't that hard, but it's not a process that you want to do on a regular basis. And you have to file those amended bylaws with the state. So you don't want to be raising red flags that you're just constantly changing the rule book. So you do want to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row before you make the amendment. If you're amending, one of the things you might want to look at is how often it says you have to meet. Here's one of the ways that you can be flexible and adaptable. Put in the bylaws whatever your state statutes require as a minimum meetings. Maybe it's annually, maybe it's twice a year, whatever. Put that as the, we will meet at least once or at least twice a year, whatever that requirement is. Then if you want to meet beyond that, great. but you're not constrained to the bylaws and in violation of the bylaws if you don't meet that often. Now, the other thing is to address those meeting requirements. A number of states have some emergency bylaws or emergency provisions that had to be used during COVID to allow for online meetings. Some of them, in some states, you cannot have an online meeting. You can have a telephone meeting, but you can't have an online because the state statutes maybe just haven't stayed up to date on that. So again, you need to know what that means. You also need to understand terminology that is, remember, these are legal documents. So the terminology is legal documentation terminology, not necessarily your everyday language. And one of them that I want to point out specifically is member. Under state law, a member is typically defined as a person or entity who pays dues or has more than a nominal connection with the organization and receives membership rights. So if you're a C3, you generally don't have members. Now you can, but that's not generally. If you're an association, you definitely have members. So just make sure that what you're thinking of as members aligns with what the state statute and the bylaws talk about in terms of membership. The next one is standing committees. I really strongly advise here not to have standing committees listed at all unless it's required by a state statute, and I'll tell you why. Once you put that in the bylaws, those committees have to occur as stated in the bylaws, no matter what circumstances may change. Now, if you do want to have some standing committees, the ones that would make sense that are not going to change on a regular basis or even on a longer term basis is potentially an executive committee or a finance committee, maybe a nominating committee, something like that. Try to limit again, though, those standing committees, because again, state law generally has requirements for those committees, how many board members have to be on them versus how many not. And now you created an exponential number of meetings for a board member. I'll give you a personal example. I sit on the board member of one organization that is affiliated with another one. And because I'm the treasurer, I now am required by all of their bylaws and standing committee situations to attend 8 different kinds of meetings for the parent organization and the other one, as well as cross-functional and committees and so forth. So it's much more of a commitment in that case than it is for the other boards that I sit on, where I'm serving as a treasurer. I have one standard board meeting and one finance meeting. That's it. So make sure that you're understanding what you're putting in those. The better way to go about it is to put in language that allows for a task force to be created as needed. That allows you to flex, like in times like this, where you could have a COVID committee, COVID response committee if you wanted. And it allows you flexibility to not have to hang on to it forever. And it allows you flexibility in what they can handle. The other thing you might want to define is their authority in terms of decision making. Standing committees can generally make and vote as and send something to a board, or sometimes executive committees can even pass something as though they're the board. So you need to make sure you understand what's said there. Task forces generally are not given authority to make any decisions. They more make recommendations, or they're actually kind of working committees. Authority of the executive committee, I just touched on a little bit. You want to make sure that their power to act on behalf of the board doesn't result in minimal voting and thereby kind of surpass the intention of having a true accountability that has a broader voice and a broader vote. The size of the board, Here's another one. Be careful how you word this, because what happens if you go through a season where you can't get board members? Now you're in violation. So the recommendation here is to consider language like no fewer than or no more than, because now you've just created adaptability within the board. For the state of Wisconsin, the required board members are 3. So your bylaws could read no fewer than 3 board members, but no more than, for instance, 9, just because you want to put a cap on it. You could just say no fewer than 3 and leave it at that too. That's fine. So don't go into too many specifics. The less specifics, obviously, the more adaptability, again, that you have. And then for voting, make sure you know what your state statutes allow. Like I said, some states did not allow for electronic meetings because that was not thought of when it was created, or the laws are not at the same level. Question in the chat box here, what kind of information about staff ED roles should be in there? Our bylaws were written when we didn't have staff, so it doesn't mention staff at all. Bylaws are intended for the board primarily and governance. You can have something in your bylaws about how the ED is hired or the board's role in doing an ED evaluation. But again, remember, these are filed with the state and these have to be followed. So if you put anything specific about board roles or staff roles in there, now you're constrained. You might be better off to adopt staff roles and staff expectations through job descriptions or other internal documents versus having that set in stone in the bylaws. Because while the bylaws can be changed, again, you don't want to be changing them on a regular basis. So it helps to have things that are flexible and adaptable. All right, IRS regulations. The Internal Revenue Service believes that a well-governed charity is more likely to obey tax laws, safeguard charitable assets, and serve charitable interests than one with poor governance or a lack of governance. I cannot overemphasize this. This is straight from their regulations and their instructions. If you look at the Form 990 and the number of questions and things that are on there, there is a majority of the form is about governance and decision-making, compensation, broader issues than just the financial status of the organization. There is also, if you are audited by the IRS, there is a 2-page checklist that is part of and mandatory questions that all deal with governance. So the IRS takes governance very seriously, and it's important to understand that. The other thing that comes right out of their playbook here is the second point. As a measure of our interest, meaning the IRS interest in this area, we ask about an organization's governance, both when it applies for status and then annually as part of that 990 filing. So this is a serious topic to them, and it's important that you stay up to date on those regulations and that you make sure that you have complied. Some of you probably have heard this from us before. One of the most common things here that falls through the crack is if you're a small enough organization to file a 990N, which is basically an informational postcard. Now it's done online, but it doesn't even ask financial information. It only asks a few questions about general demographic kind of information. But if you fail to file that for 3 years, you automatically lose your status as a charity or as a nonprofit organization. And they will not, the IRS will not send you notice. It'll just be gone. Your status will be gone and you could be operating then in violation. So it's important to understand that. Another thing that came up in some of the discussions here was an awareness that the bylaws had to be submitted to the state. They do. They're a state requirement. So again, you have to go back to those state statutes, and we're going to continue to get there. And I'll give you some general information on where to look for things, but keep in mind that every state is a little different. So obviously I cannot address all of the various state requirements in this format since we have more than one state. Here's one example though, because we are based out of Wisconsin. I do have the Wisconsin state statute website addressed here. You can do the same thing in your own state just by Googling state statutes for nonprofit corporation. It should come up pretty easily. If you cannot find it, please, you'll have my contact information in this. Go ahead and send me an email and I will try and help you locate the source for it to come up with it. Again, I really recommend that you get comfortable with those state statutes because that's where it's going to determine what your state filing requirements are. We already talked about the board member minimums, and in emergency situations like COVID, what things are applicable or what kind of alternative formats can be taken to meet criteria for governance. So let's go ahead and do our third poll question because I'm curious to know, and please be honest, there will be no judgment here. Have you read your state statutes for nonprofit governance? Wow, I really appreciate the honesty I'm seeing here. Thank you everyone for responding. I applaud you for being honest, but here's my challenge then to you, is to go find your state statutes and read through them. I know that reading legal documents is not necessarily the most fun or easy thing to do, but it's important that if you're operating and if you are especially a member of a board and you have agreed to take on the fiduciary responsibility of being on that board, you should know what your state statutes say. You can also likely in this day and age for most states find a local law firm or other site that will summarize the key points if you don't want to read or you don't necessarily understand the legalese in the statutes. But it is important that you're familiar with them and you know what's in them, because that obviously is the law surrounding your organization. All right, few other considerations. Now, one of the things I probably scared some of you, and I don't mean to, you have plenty of support, there's plenty of resources. Please don't ever hesitate to ask questions or reach out to people and ask your board to do more, or if you're a board member, take the decision to be a board member very seriously. But it shouldn't stop at just the legal requirements. And the legal requirements should be such a thing that once you've got a well-run, established organization, they kind of go, you know, along with standard operating procedure and do not become a major roadblock. But you can't take that for granted. You need to make sure that that's considered. Beyond that, then, consider what kind of board do you really have? Have you been recruiting board members more for advisory services? Have you been recruiting for fundraising more for board members? Or is it more of an operational board where they're actually involved in the day-to-day service of clientele and so forth? That will help you understand too how much of governance is maybe not the first priority of your board, and therefore you need to look to certain board members to take that responsibility, and you need to have some of those conversations. Another thing that I mentioned earlier, and I'm skipping around here just a little bit and I'll come back, is when you have those board meetings, are your minutes adequate? I can tell you one of the most interesting things as an auditor is to read minutes. Some of them are like reading a small town newspaper, and they're pretty chatty and full of interesting tidbits, but nothing of organizational consequence or operational decisions. So make sure the minutes have sufficient detail in terms of the decision-making that has to be done by the board and the approvals that are required by the board, because that's important. In some of those cases where the IRS has come in and looked at an organization, one of the things that quite often they ding the organization on is the minutes that do not describe the expectations of what the governance should be making decisions on and documenting as decisions. So that's an important piece. And there's lots of templates out there, and there's a lot of ways to do minutes without making it, you know, some complicated thing. You just have to make sure the right pieces are documented. Now, along with that, you have to make sure that your board members know what their roles are. So maybe I have done more of recruiting for board for fundraising than for governance. Okay, great. I can talk to them and say, you know, I really appreciate this role, but I want you also to understand here is your governance compliance role according to state statute. At a minimum, like I said, that onboarding should include the bylaws and maybe a summary of here's the key things that you're responsible for as a board member, so that it's very clear to them. Now, one of the big things that was impacted during COVID was internal controls. And those of you who've been around Wagner before or listened to some of our trainings know that this is a very important topic to us. We talk constantly about internal controls because internal controls are intended to safeguard the assets of the company or the organization. Now, safeguarding assets implies, or first thing that a lot of people think, is just preventing fraud. Yes, that's important, but the internal controls are also important, catching just mistakes, making sure that things are adequately documented, making sure we have the right information. If you think about it, that information aspect and protection of sound, solid information is as critical an issue as fraud prevention is. Because if you don't have good controls and good information, guess what? You're making decisions basically in the dark because you're not making it based on sound data and sound information. So one of the things with internal control is having segregation of duties so that you don't have the same person doing too many areas of control. So for instance, let's say I had a bookkeeper who is the receptionist, opens all the mail, gets all the checks in from donors, makes all the bank deposits, sends all the thank you notes, and does all the general ledger work. Anybody getting a little bit creeped out now and a little concerned? I hope so. Because you've just given that person all kinds of control that could easily divert funds. So the goal is to protect the organization, the information, as well as the person who's responsible. You know, one of the things you want to say is, well, I trust my bookkeeper. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you hire well. But one of the best things you can do for somebody you trust and that you count on is also protect them. And if something were to happen, guess who they're going to point a finger at first? So you want to have those controls that also protect the person. Policies, we've talked a number of different places about policies that a board should have. I do think that's an important thing, but policies are only as good as if they're kept up to date and they're actually implemented. If you have policies that are sitting on a shelf and no one knows about them or never uses them, they're no good. So monitoring policies and making sure they're meaningful and implemented is more critical than just obviously having them. It is important for a board to have financial literacy. There's different ways to do that, and we talk about ways that we can make it more visual for non-accounting kind of people. But everybody on the board should be comfortable answering some basic financial questions and basic understanding, or the person presenting the financial information to the board should format it in such a structure that you can make those critical decisions. There was a great example that I saw recently of a school that had K through 12 grades, and basically the bottom line was they were losing money and they couldn't figure out why. Well, the typical financial statements were not helpful to the board until somebody came along and took the same information and structured it in a picture format, and it showed that K through 8th grade was making money. It was the high school that was sucking out the funds. Now, as a board, you can start making better decisions. How do we make the high school more profitable? Do we continue with the high school? But until you had that financial literacy on what was the underlying issue here, you couldn't do a lot. And that's where I think it's really important to have some board training. So there's plenty of resources, including Wagner, when it comes to board training. But I would highly recommend that to happen on a periodic basis, because board members rotate, and therefore it's important that everyone is kept up to speed. All right, another question that came in here is if you're operating in multiple states, which state statute do you need to follow? It's the state in which you're incorporated, is for the bylaws and the basic legal requirements of filing as a nonprofit. Now, with that being said, if you're soliciting funds in multiple states, you do have multiple state responsibilities, and you may be subject to some requirements in those other states. So your primary state is where you're incorporated, but that does not get you off the hook from other ones that you may be operating in. Another thing is, do you have to include who made the motion, second the motion, or can you just say a motion was made, second, and passed? I would go back to your state laws again and your bylaws to determine that. Some state laws have that you have to follow Robert's Rules of Order. Some you can circumvent some of those things with bylaws that state that it can be passed by a general majority vote. So you have to attribute and make those things in the minutes, however it's stated either in state statute or bylaws is what you're looking for. All right, now some of these we already kind of touched on, but I want to go back to, now that you have the whole picture a little more so, some of the considerations for the bylaws. As the main operating manual for the nonprofit, it is important that those rules are clear, but you don't want them so specific that it impedes flexibility. So one of the ones I mentioned earlier is the number of board members. Go with at least X number according to state statute. Now you have maximum flexibility, but you still have met the consideration and the regulatory factor required by your state. Back to the question about, how to make a decision on a vote. The bylaws are your guide to those actions. And in most cases, it's the bylaws that are going to determine that, not state law. So it could be such that you want Robert's rules. In some cases, maybe you don't. Put that then in there. Talk about how you're going to make decisions. One of the other things I would consider, and this is not specific just to this or thinking about COVID storm, this is more a broad board issue, is you might want to consider always having an executive session at a board meeting. Why? Well, if you think about an executive session, what that means is it's generally limited to only board members. So ED often has to leave, because generally the ED is part of the board, but not a voting member, and therefore leaves during executive session. any other guests, etc. Now, the reason to do it each time is so that then if somebody has been hesitant to voice something earlier, it provides that forum. Plus, you just start setting a rhythm that that executive session is always available at the end of the meeting, so that if something serious comes up, it's not a red flag that, oh, we've never had executive session before, now we're going to have one. So there must be something wrong. So that's another consideration here with an executive session kind of situation. Keep in mind, like we said earlier, if you fail to follow the bylaws as the board, you can be held liable for breaching your duty to the nonprofit. And again, not to scare, but to inform and advise and make sure that everybody is well aware, because that's the big point here. You want to avoid specifics like we talked about, and the language, simple language of shall do versus may. Shall makes it a requirement, may makes it an option. So it could be the board shall meet once a year and may meet additional times as needed. Now you've put the absolute requirement, but you've left yourself flexibility. So sometimes when we put those bylaws together, we kind of do the kitchen sink approach where we throw in everything. I would advise, if you are going to at any point go back and amend your bylaws, take some time to look through all these different points. And like I said, do it in one comprehensive change versus other things. To the earlier point about keeping out some other things, I would keep out anything that is a job description or marketing guidelines or specific dates and times for meetings, anything like that, because now you've just made it more complicated in terms of what you have to comply with. Another question coming in, do minutes need to be taken during the executive session? No, that's the point. As executive session, it's off the record, which allows for that confidentiality, so that it allows for a forum to have, you know, some tough things talked about. But you cannot, let's say that the executive session is about, for lack of a better example off the top of my head, poor performance by the ED, okay? It's important to have that discussion off the record, maybe, you know, figure out what the specifics are, what the action steps are, and what you want to do as a board. But then it has to be officially on record if you decide to put, let's say, the executive director on a performance plan or decide to fire. Then that decision would be put back in the full board minutes at another time. The executive session is intended for conversation, not for the ultimate decision. Few other things that we've talked about. The size of the board, like I said, can make it really complex. I love the idea of saying at a minimum and going with the board standard required by the state statutes and not going farther than that. Here's another interesting one we didn't talk about earlier, which is board terms. Some organizations will put in term limits designed to make sure that the board stays fresh and that you don't get a stale board or permanent kind of board members, lifers. There's pros and cons to the different extremes in terms of terminology or board terms of having maybe just a single year versus lifetime kind of things. Here again, I recommend some flexibility with a little bit of a caveat. I would decide how long is too long, because you don't want a board member sitting in the same position for forever. So maybe it's that after 2 terms or 3 terms, they have to step off for at least a year or something like that in there. The other thing you want to consider is your officers. I have worked with several organizations where the president and treasurer especially have a really hard time if their board terms are limited to 1 year. You barely get up to speed in the learning curve where it needs to be to have a 1-year term for treasurers or presidents. But you also don't want those positions to be forever. So the ones that I personally kind of have adapted to and liked the most is looking at somewhere around a 3-year term for those 2 key positions. And maybe it can be such too that you're training the next one in transition. I recently had an organization who had a treasurer for 3 years. The treasurer was awesome. And what they did in their last 6 months was they transitioned to the new treasurer and kind of mentored them through the process. So it was a seamless transition and no information was lost. You also might want to consider, do you need meeting guidelines? And if so, what are they? Again, be careful you don't get too specific, because then you're going to constrain yourself down the road. Officers, I do think it's wise to have some information about the core officer group, meaning president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary. One of the things that has surprised me is occasionally I have come across board minutes or board bylaws that do not have a treasurer position. To me, that's an essential position. But if you have, as a board, considered it carefully and you have a strong rationale, that's fine. Put it in your bylaws that it's president, vice president, and secretary. Just make sure that it fits the norms and the expectations for your organizations. Committees we talked about. Be careful to not have too many standing committees or things that are absolutely required. Make them more flexible as a task force or something that can happen and be disbanded so that it's not a constant, permanent, lifetime thing. And then actually having an exit plan. If you're a for-profit, one of the things that tax advisors regularly work with for-profits on is having an exit strategy or a succession plan. So those are both important to nonprofits. How do you plan to succeed? Leadership or transition, like I was just mentioning, key roles like president or treasurer. But what if you ultimately get to the end of a useful life and you want to dissolve? How do you want that to happen? Now, there are state laws, but you can also, again, put some things here that can make that process easier and not having to go back to just state law to do that. One thing that hopefully you're aware of is when a nonprofit dissolves, it cannot have any of the funding go to private individuals. The funding has to go to another 501c3 organization, because obviously as a not-for-profit, there can't be owners, therefore nobody privately can benefit, and the funds have to then be sent to or given to another nonprofit organization to retain that integrity and status. All right, we're getting close to the top of the hour here. Questions as we're going through? I know some of them have been coming in and I appreciate that.
Yeah, we did have one question. Can you hire or fire decisions and votes be made in executive session?
No, they would have to be documented. Now, well, let me step back on that. First of all, the board shouldn't be hiring or firing anybody but the ED. The ED or other staff members should be responsible for other hiring and firing decisions. If it's an ED decision, then ideally, yes, you could talk about it in that executive session and make a recommendation, but you would come back in unofficial minutes then say that the board has voted to or approved dismissal or hiring of this individual. Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Here is my contact information. We're always happy to answer questions. Anything that didn't get answered today will be followed up with an email. Keep in mind, if you were not here right away when we started, when I explained why my picture isn't up, I am right now in vacation mode, so you will not be seeing the responses quite as quickly as sometimes, but I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I really would value it if you would take time to complete the survey that comes out after the sessions, because we take that very seriously and it guides how we continue to offer different parts of training and resources to the community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melody. Just a final reminder, yes, please keep your eyes open for an email from us. You will have the recording from today, the presentation, deck slides, and that survey that Melody just mentioned. So thank you all for your time today and your questions. Back to those questions we didn't have a chance to offer today, or we didn't have a chance to answer today. Thank you, Melody, for your expertise, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, Melody.
Thank you.